Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In one of our recent videos, Turtle Life 2035 asked the following question. If the Empire has such a monopoly over all military defense, production, how does the Rebel Alliance come up with its own navy? How do they get all of these ships together? Turtle Life, are you asking me to do a video about Rebel procurement? Because I will. I will. So yeah, as our viewer mentioned, the Galactic Empire has almost complete control over the defense industry in the galaxy. As the old Palpy McScrotum faced in, just nationalized the military and nationalized the entire process of making war a thing. From the moment raw resources are pulled out of an asteroid belt, or Ewok, to where those materials are refined, fabricated, designed, assembled, tested, and finally deployed. The Empire is either directly in charge, or sitting in the boardroom, or holding the CEO's family in some black site prison in the Outer Rim. Mining guilds, refining combines, ship designers, component manufacturers, hyperdrive firms, reactor specialists, every link in the chain is either Imperial owned, Imperial licensed, or dependent on Imperial contracts to survive. Now, having this level of nationalization in industrial policy basically gives you a centrally planned war economy. And this is really what every strongman, authoritarian, hyper-nationalistic warhawk dreams about. The entire country unified to devote all of its resources, manpower, and technology to create an elite fighting machine. Ideally led by a vanguard of Gundam mobile suits. And we've all met people like this before, especially on the internet. They're usually very nostalgic for a past they weren't even alive for. They say stuff like, oh, I wish I was back during the Napoleonic age, when times were better, when real men didn't hide behind cover and stood strong in the face of musket fire. Or worse, you have those guys who wish they were back alive when the Crusades happened. Think, bro, do you actually want to be wearing chainmail and a heavy tunic in that sun in the Middle East in some desert? Be a good Christian, just volunteer at a local soup kitchen, you nerd. Total war, living in a centrally planned war economy is usually really not a good thing. If you take a look at the Star Wars galaxy, killing the Jedi didn't affect the average citizens nearly as much as the economic policies of Palpatine when he started that massive military buildup for essentially no reason. First, things have to be pretty messed up for your entire society to abandon everything and just focus on building weapons for war. In the last few hundred years, there have only been a few examples of this actually happening. During World War II, for instance, most major powers like Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States took this route and had some version of a, planned total war military economy. And even for the Americans, it wasn't easy for the people involved. Yet women recycled their metal household appliances, kids their metal toys for weapons and munitions, gasoline, meat, sugar, butter, and coffee. These things are all rationed. People started planting gardens at home to feed themselves to put less strain on the agricultural sector. Private companies lost autonomy, and the War Production Board dictated what companies produced. Hey Frank, I know you guys make refrigerators, but now you're making Sherman tanks. And a lot of factories' workers had to do mandatory overtime. Wages were also frozen, and conditions were often very dangerous. And a lot of unions in the country even agreed to a no-strike pledge with the government. And that is the good total war situation, the best possible outcome when you are involved in this kind of policy. The worst case, probably China. In the 50s and 60s, they effectively tried to run a planned war-style economy during Mao's era. This was wild because China was not involved in any active conflict with anyone except maybe capitalism. In that sense, what they're doing is much more reminiscent to the Galactic Empire's own centrally planned war economy, which was also created during a period of peace. The Great Leap Forward, as it was called, was a catastrophic leap backwards. In one specific example, Mao forced the farmers in the country to melt down all of their tools and equipment to produce steel for his ambitious industrialization plan. Problem is, farmers don't really know how to produce high-quality steel from farm tools in their backyard, and so what Mao had instead was a ton of pig iron that was, useless for a lot of high-end industrial application, and you also had a bunch of farmers who couldn't ply the land because they didn't have tools. This, along with a few other factors, generated a massive famine that killed a lot of people and created generational sickness and illness in people as well. It also created deep levels of trauma across huge portions of the population and, in my opinion, fundamentally changed China's culture. And to this day, elderly Chinese men and women who have survived that period, their love language towards you is usually, have you eaten, or have you eaten enough? And, they might not be able to express their emotions to you properly, but they will make you a plate of fruit or a really nice meal to say, I love you, because food was essentially That's essentially everything. And I think this is also common in other cultures where you've run into famine. And so, no, hard times don't create strong men. Only people who have lived in great periods of peace can say nonsense like that. And that's because we're all born naturally with a level of resilience. And ideally, if we're protected when we're young, when we're a baby and toddler, we can grow up into strong, adults. But people who grow up in survival conditions or famine or extreme poverty, they don't become stronger. They become cautious, hardened, and often distrustful of one another. They have health issues and mental issues that might last a lifetime as well. And then when the entire country has to go through that issue, you see a complete collapse in trust and cohesion in society. The Great Leap Forward would set the preconditions for the Cultural Revolution, which was even more vicious and horrific because it turned the people against each other, and in some cases, even families were ripped apart. And so total war economies are no joke, and no, they don't always bring unity and efficiency to the country. Sometimes a total war economy will break apart your nation. Sometimes it destroys the economy and dismantles civil society. And if we take a look at the Galactic Empire, that is exactly what happened. People went from working good jobs in factories to being forced to work overtime, which soon turned into mandatory hours with no pay. And then, should you choose to attend that Cobalt Liberation Front meeting at your local bar and attempt to unionize, the Empire might pick you up in one of their anti-rebel sweeps, at which point you end up doing the same job, but now for free in an Imperial work camp. When you disrupt every industry, when you take resources and manpower from those industries and direct them into the military-industrial complex because you want to just build endless amounts of weapons, you end up gutting out those other portions of the economy, and that leads to a lot of shortages and weaknesses. Also leads to price fluctuation for everyday goods. And since the first tariff or trade regulation was created by man, there have always been this other unique human phenomenon known as the black market, which usually runs parallel to the normal market that is regulated and overseen. For instance, when the Mandalorians decided to stay neutral during the Clone Wars, no one came to help when their shipments for foodstuff was being cut off by the conflict. And so naturally, Prime Minister established links to criminal elements to get those essential shipments through the black markets. That, of course, led to those very criminals realizing how unguarded and weak the planet had become, which eventually leads to a complete takeover of the planet by criminals. Now imagine that happening at a massive scale, which it did happen during the Imperial period. I mean, most of the early missions the rebellion flew were not combat related, but instead focused on delivering food and essential aid to impoverished worlds full of Imperial civilians. Now, we've also talked in length how the Republic featured a very advanced economy with hyper-specialization, which means you have entire worlds that focus on just one product, like agricultural goods. This type of specialization creates huge scale, which lowers cost and efficiency of production. It also then allows for another type of planet to exist like Taris or Coruscant, which has almost no domestic food production. But if there is a massive war like we see during the Clone Wars or economic decline which we see during the Imperial era, that specialized economy suddenly becomes a problem. Yeah, you could have, weaknesses in certain areas that lead to shortages in goods. When the COVID pandemic hit our world more than half a decade ago, that's exactly what happened to many industries. You had supply side problems as trade and economic activity declined significantly. I mean, everything was a mess. I remember car dealerships selling Corvettes for like 100% markup on their sticker price. I remember, I was trying to buy a Tacoma, and I recall that used Tacomas were like more expensive than the sticker price for a new one. So it was a pretty crazy time, and that's what happens when you essentially are too dependent on these more complicated supply chains. When a government isn't able to handle these basic things, provide a stable environment for the economy to flourish, provide opportunities to the job market, and provide security to allow trade to flow freely, then people start looking for alternative ways to live. And during the Imperial period, many otherwise normal citizens became criminals, smugglers, mercenaries, bounty hunters. I mean, most of the interesting characters in Star Wars lore inhabit one of these professions, and that should really tell you something about the state of the galaxy. These jobs are seen as fringe, as socially unacceptable. The fact that so many normies are attracted to those jobs is not a good sign. And so this idea of the Empire somehow being able to control all industrial production in the galaxy only really works on paper. This idea that the Empire was a well-oiled machine with a bunch of very loyal and efficient, officers and enlisted men, well, that also it's also a lie. What you really had was a system of pillage and a hierarchy of gangsters. Everyone steals, but the people at the top steal the most and get away with the most. And so without a proper system of checks and balances, you have rampant corruption at all levels of the military. For instance, the proton torpedo is pound for pound one of the most destructive munitions in the galaxy. The rebels favored this type of munition because their advanced snub fighters could carry multiple torpedoes and pose a huge threat to even the largest capital ships as a result. The Empire tried its best to restrict access to proton torpedoes, but obviously it didn't work. Proton torpedoes and bombs would end up being one of the #1 killers of Imperial capital ships, especially in the early years of the conflict. Heck, both of the Death Stars were actually taken out by proton torpedoes. The problem lay in Palpatine's decision to crack down on the, institutions that were supposed to watch over the military. Without those checks and balances in place, any political or military leader in charge of any type of procurement could start taking kickbacks from vendors and suppliers. When corruption like this is so blatant and seen by everyone, it starts to infect the entire institution of the military, which is not a good thing. Maybe Steve, the certified forklift operator, starts stashing a few extra proton torpedoes on the side to sell to his Corellian friend who also has connections to the rebellion. And remember, the rebellion had less of a funding problem than you would think, especially if you consider how small their military force actually was. You also had rich donors like Luthen Rael Mon Mothma and Bail Organa who could each personally field small private armies. It was really getting your hands on the actual weapons and war material that was the most difficult. Now, capital ships were pretty much the only thing that the rebellion couldn't buy on the black market. First, thanks to consolidation, only quad-drive yards and Corellian Engineering Corporation really were building capital ships anymore, and the Empire could pretty easily control where those ships were going to be sold to. And so the majority of rebel capital ships had to be procured in, pretty smart and innovative ways. The first batch of CR-90s came from the Organa Household Guard. These were diplomatic vessels designed to be extremely fast and outrun their enemies. It's perfectly suited for the type of missions that the rebellion faced. When the Mon Calamari joined the rebellion, they brought with them repurposed underwater civic buildings that were heavily reinforced, and an entire merchant fleet of massive cruisers which were refitted with additional shields and weapons. The rebellion also heavily targeted the Nebulon B escort frigate for theft that were used for long-range patrols and escort missions. It really wasn't until the last year of the war that we finally saw larger New Republic vessels that were purpose-built for war, like the Mark I Starhawk battleship. As far as starfighters went, the rebels did have more options. You could find a lot of aging starfighters in the scrapyards and salvage yards, for instance. The Y-Wing is probably the most famous of the older snub fighters used by the rebellion, but they also fielded ARC 170s, V-Wings, Delta 78 Spice, Headhunters, pretty much anything you could think of. They were trying to get into the air. Now, Incom Corporation had been nationalized by the Empire shortly after the Clone Wars ended, and most of their design and engineering staff actually defected, and they brought to the rebellion the prototype blueprints for the X-Wing. Quad Systems Engineering, before it was sold off to Senior, had sold the A-Wing prototype plan to a local defense force, and the rebellion would buy the plan from them. In both cases, the X-Wing and the A-Wing were built in small, oftentimes mobile hangars and garages. Most of this work is done by hand with maybe some minimal droid assistance, but yeah, no assembly lines, no scaling. Their entire starfighter force in the beginning was bespoke, which is kind of impressive. And this would ever work for a galaxy-wide empire that has to field millions of fighters. But the rebellion just needed enough ships to survive the next battle, and then the next. It was always just about outliving the empire and just allowing them to sabotage and destroy themselves. And also the rebels were kind of crazy. They were really dedicated to the cause. I mean, they had a lot of heart. And while it's hard to quantify the culture and mindset of an organization, sometimes that is the difference. And sometimes that difference is enough to overwhelm much larger hurdles like a lack of resources, a lack of manpower, a lack of political capital, a lack of manufacturing and industrial assets. All of this could describe the rebellion. It could also describe a country like Ukraine, who is fighting a much larger and better armed Russia. More than 40 countries have actually donated weapon systems and munitions or just cash to their cause. And one of the unintended consequences of this is the Ukrainians are probably fielding one of the most diverse vehicle pools that the world has ever seen. I mean, it blows what the Saudis had, a few years back. It blows what the Qing dynasty had a few years, many years ago. And I remember looking at the list of just different vehicles the Ukrainians have, and it was giving me anxiety. I mean, just the logistical needs are crazy. You have Soviet-era vehicles and weapon systems, and you bring in a mix of European, American, and NATO standard stuff. I mean, we just take a look at their IFV motor pool. They have a bunch of BMPs of different shapes and variants from different periods. They also have the Swedish CB90 XC90, which is basically just the Volvo XC90 with explosive reactive armor. They also got the German Marder IFV along with those M2 Bradleys. And that's just the infantry fighting vehicle. I mean, wait till you look at their small arms and just how wild that gets. Including this thing called the Malu, which is a homegrown bullpup based around the internal workings of an AK-74. And yes, it can also chamber NATO rounds. You see that kind of flexibility and also broke-ass innovation from Ukraine because they pretty much don't have a choice. This is what they can do with the resources available to them. And so, yeah, when the Ukrainians get a bunch of M1 Abrams tanks, is it the cutting-edge variant with the depleted uranium armor and, sensor and network upgrade package? Probably not. Will the Ukrainians be able to operate and push those M1s as hard and continuously as we did during the opening hours of Desert Storm? Probably not. The maintenance and fuel logistic nightmares here can only be dreamt up by a country of excess, extreme excess, which of course the United States is. And so what do resourceful Ukrainian units do? They do radical compartmentalization in order to basically keep all of these vehicles operational. That's not just a mechanized brigade, that's a Bradley brigade. And the motor pool guys in that brigade will know how to work on the Bradley, make basic repairs, perhaps cannibalize other units to get things functioning, or, make some Mad Max-like alterations. Just like any frontline unit. Now, if any of those NATO vehicles get heavily damaged and they're recovered, they're usually sent to Poland or some other neighboring country where you have NATO mechanics who are able to get these things up and running. Or not NATO mechanics, but sometimes it's the actual defense contractors. They will have a presence. Also, at this point of the conflict, it seems like both sides are really treating their armored vehicles with a lot more care. I mean, the Ukrainians definitely don't have the luxury of losing their limited supply of vehicles, and even the Russians are being a bit more cautious with the heavy stuff. I've seen a lot of dual sports and ATVs, which is wild. It's crazy. But again, that is what happens when your nation has a strong cause to fight for, just like the Rebel Alliance. And all throughout history, smaller armies, smaller factions that face overwhelming odds, they typically do rely on their own ingenuity and courage to kind of get the job done. One of the big benefits that the Rebel Alliance has that the Ukrainians don't actually have is that the Rebel Alliance starts off pretty much as a blank slate, without much political or cultural baggage, without much military heritage. There wasn't really a set way to do things. Everyone was breaking eggs and experimenting from day one. And yes, a lot of people died, some needlessly because of this, but as a result, the Rebel Alliance was a lean, mean fighting machine, almost a startup army kind of, that relied heavily on innovation and surprise to defeat a superior enemy. And building X-Wings in tiny garages and stealing escort frigates were all a part of that vibe. The Empire, on the other hand, was far too big, too impersonal, and so they had to rely on systems, poorly designed systems, to direct their war effort. And like a massive ship, this thing does not turn quickly or react quickly, which of course gave the rebellion the opening they needed to survive until they started thriving. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.